Hey everyone, it's Dan here with the Revelation Deception, and it is my goal in this study to help you see that there is actually a second Exodus in accord with the so-called second coming. And I say so-called because the second coming of Christ is really what the Greek word parousia refers to, and it involves much more than Christ himself coming a second time, hence second coming, but actually a host of events throughout the day of judging, which is a study in itself. But here in this study, I am going to try and stay focused on the Exodus of the faithful out of trial. You see, Satan has done a magnificent job at replacing the knowledge of the second Exodus with the misapplied doctrine of what many still refer to as the Rapture, which is a word not even found in the scripture. Now, much division and debate has arisen from this faulty doctrine, and any doctrine that causes so much controversy and discord among those who are supposed to be united in one body and one spirit should be questioning such things, because the living God is not the God of confusion and division. Now, as for this word rapture, let's just call it for what it is, being the Greek word harpazo. It's utterly amazing how so much false doctrine can be derived from such a word that occurs only 13 times in the New Testament, and only one occurrence out of the 13 being that found in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 17, which Christianity has built the foundation of this so-called rapture doctrine upon, completely out of context of what it really signifies and when it will actually take place. Now, God willing, I will make other studies where I go into much more detail about this subject of the harpazo, or snatching away. But let me just say this, that the context of 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 17 occurs after the tribulation of those days, at the consummation, before the final and the dreadful day of the Lord manifests, and that manifestation being in accord with the enemies of God in the final destruction and the burning up of the earth, which Peter goes into some detail in his second epistle, when those who are rescued out of trial and in Exodus will be hoping and hurrying God's day, which is subsequent to the day of the Lord. So I can't stress enough that this so-called rapture is not an event that is next to occur on God's divine calendar. Which brings us to the subject of this study, being the Exodus, which is the next to occur, and of which most today seem to be completely ignorant of. And I emphasize ignore because the truth is right there for us to see if we search it, but we have failed to do so because we listen to men and we ignore what God has given us, being His Word and His Spirit, the Spirit of truth, in revealing these things to our perception. And once you realize that there is an Exodus, as mentioned 3 times in the New Testament, it only makes sense that the harpazo is not the Exodus, because obviously they are different words and they have different definitions and completely different contexts. In fact, most don't even realize that the word Exodus occurs 3 times in the New Testament because of faulty Bible translations. So it is my honest effort to wake some of you up to the events about to unfold among the faithful, as Peter outlined, as it pertains to the Exodus, which is the rescue of the devout out of trial, the godly, while God and Christ will keep the unjust into judging. Not rapture, not harpazo, or the snatching away, which occurs, like I said, at the consummation after the affliction and after the day of judging. Now, out of the 3 occurrences of the Greek word exodos, in the New Testament, the primary one concerning Peter's instructions to his sheep, his flock, that is, that Jesus himself instructed him 3 times to feed, I will quote from the very misunderstood King James translation, which is pretty much useless. It's a useless rendering, which I will, at the end of this study, scrutinize and break this verse down with all of the 12 Greek words and their various definitions and uses in order to come up with a more coherent understanding. But for now, let's just look at the present rendering of the King James Version. It states, "Moreover, I will endeavor that ye may be able after my decease," exodos, "to have these things always in remembrance." And that is 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 15. So here in this verse we find one of 3 occurrences of the Greek word exodos, and it is translated decease. Now, as it is translated here, one would naturally assume that Peter was speaking of his own personal death or his decease, because this is how the King James translated, or I should say erroneously translated, the Greek word exodos. And it is not verse 15 that addresses Peter's death, but it is the previous verse where Peter states in verse 14 that my tabernacle, my body, is to be put off swiftly, according as the Lord Jesus Christ also makes evident to me. What we will see is that none of these 3 occurrences of Exodus speak of anyone's death, for that matter. Now, if you look at the same verse in the concordant literal translation, you will see that they at least transliterated the Greek exodos as exodus. But even the concordant literal version made a mess of this verse. Peter's use of the Greek word exodos was not speaking of his death, departure, or decease. Neither does the Greek word exodus describe a rapture into clouds to be forever with Jesus Christ when the judgment will first be reported as read in Matthew chapter 12 verses 18 and 19. And as for Peter's own death, the reason he mentioned it in verse 14, the previous verse, was out of urgency in rousing those hearing among all present among his own to the far-off future event of the Exodus. And not only that, but this epistle also addresses us today, who should also be heeding Peter's warnings and instructions as a reminder of future events in accord with the Exodus of the devout out of trial. Now, before I meticulously break down 2 Peter 1:15 and render a clearer translation, first let's consider the definition of the word Exodus, because we are establishing that this is not speaking in the context of Peter's death or anyone's death. And it's not very complicated, because an exodus is a mass departure of people, especially immigrants. It's a withdrawal or an evacuation of a large number of people, not the death of one person. And if you don't already know the difference between emigrant, EMI, immigrants, and immigrants, emigrants are those who leave their existing or their own country in order to settle permanently in another, while immigrants describe those who come to live permanently in a foreign country as newcomers. So in the context of the body of Christ, in accord with Peter's second epistle, this emigration will be the call to be led out of trial on a journey that will lead into the new heaven and earth. You see? And this journey is also termed in Greek the epichorgeo, and it's spelled EPICHOREGEO. And it's very similar to our English word choreography. And although the lexicons don't define it as such, what it really is a type and a shadow of is the choreography as seen in the Eastern wedding and betrothal ceremony, which is a figure seen all through the scriptures as pertaining to the parousia, or the second coming, when the saints as God's holy messengers first will gather the prudent and watching virgins. And it's all through the Exodus when these will be served by those who will oversee them as the husbandmen, as those who will serve as administrators, of which I'll talk more about in a little bit. But back to the subject of Exodus as it is translated in Luke and Peter as if it was pertaining to one's death. Plainly, according to the definition of Exodus, to translate the Greek word exodos as departure or decease in the context of one person's death is just not suitable. And as for the three occurrences of exodos, none of them are speaking of the death of any one person or death at all. What we'll soon discover is that the context is actually the Exodus, and rather in accord with resurrection, not death. But before we get into 2 Peter 1:15 in any kind of detail, let's consider the other two occurrences first. One of them is found in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 22, which, reading from the King James translation again on this verse, reads, "By faith Joseph, when he died, made mention of the departing," again exodos, "of the children of Israel, and gave commandment concerning his bones." So here we see some shared characteristics with Peter's context of Exodus, with what we just read. First, the Greek word manuo, which is translated made mention, actually means to give reminder. The same is seen in Peter's account, where he also speaks of a reminder 3 times, in fact, in context of bringing to their remembrance something before he was to die himself, which is the second characteristic, because Joseph also was about to die. And just like Joseph at his death was wanting to remind them of the Exodus, so was Peter doing the same at his death. But understand, this Exodus was not in accord with Israel, but the body of Christ and those he was writing to. Now, as for Joseph, clearly the context is not Joseph's death, but the mass emigration or exodus of the children of Israel out of Egypt. Yes, Joseph, like Peter, was about to die, but the Exodus was not describing Joseph's death. And why the translators did not simply choose to consistently use the transliteration Exodus like the concordant literal version is beyond me. I guess that would have just been too easy, huh? Let me show how inconsistent Bible translations can actually be in confusing the mind of the casual reader of Scripture. Now, even though I prefer the concordant version, and it has done a lot to correct many of these problems, it too falls short many times. And the point being is that we must all be diligent in doing our own due diligence when studying the Scriptures that men have translated. Let's do some comparisons of these verses as it relates to Peter's mention of Exodus and Joseph's. And then I'll do the same also with the concordant literal version. First, notice how the King James Version inconsistently translated exodos in 2 Peter and Hebrews. And this is very deceiving because, as we stated, death is not a departing to heaven, but sleep. That is, now, unless you have attained to the out-resurrection, out from the dead, or the ex-anastasis, which Peter did not attain to, and which is a topic for another video. But my point is to show the utter fallacy in Bible translations. Now, next, look at the concordant literal version and notice how they actually transliterated the Greek exodos into exodus, which they did actually with all 3 occurrences. But in 2 Peter, they added the reflective pronoun my. as if Peter was speaking of his personal exodus and not the exodus. And understand that reflective pronouns like here in Luke are selected by the translators at their own discretion, so they must reflect the proper thing. Now, look at the description of Joseph's death in the King James Version compared to the concordant literal version. This is the Greek telutao, and the King James Version did a pretty good job here stating that Joseph, he died. But what about the concordant literal version? They choose the word decease, which is okay, but when you consider that the King James Version translated exodus as decease in Peter's account, we start seeing the confusion that creeps up, and only when examining these two verses of Scripture side by side and using a concordance lexicon to examine them. So, my friends, this is an ongoing problem throughout many, many verses in the Bible. And this is why we must take advantage of Bible concordances, lexicons, and dictionaries. I cannot stress this enough. So let's consider the Greek telutao and the translation decease as if it was in the context of Peter's exodus, which it isn't. Telutao means to come to an end, as in die. So according to old King Jimmy, if Peter was communicating his death as an exodus, so the deception is accomplished, because as we already defined exodus, it is far from the definition of death or even an end. And if telutao was good enough to describe Joseph's death, why not Peter's? Because the context of Exodus has not anything to do with either of these men's deaths. On the contrary, it's rather a journey into a new beginning. And as the very word Exodus is defined, it speaks of a mass or a large number of people in an emigration. Not a sleep or a rest as death is often figured in Scripture. And as for the word Exodus in the verse of Hebrews just examined, it supports the very definition of what an Exodus is, because it speaks of the sons of Israel, of whom could have potentially included millions, who were emigrating towards the land of promise as a type and a shadow of when the dead will be roused to either go into Exodus or into judging, all of which is before the manifestation of the new heaven and earth, when the devout who had gone through the time of judging in pasture will be hoping and hurrying the day of God. Now, Paul states in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 that for the body of Christ, the sons of Israel, who were also under the cloud, were types of us. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 1 and verses 6. Now ask yourself, were the sons of Israel raptured into heaven through their journey in the wilderness? Were they raptured or snatched away quickly into clouds? Well, of course not. They were under that supernatural divine cloud of protection, being provided for and fed supernatural food from heaven, as it will be in the second Exodus when the present administration ends and the second watch of Luke chapter 12, verse 38, roused to become administrators who will give measure of grain in season to all who are attending in Exodus, and to be placed over all his possessions, as read in Luke chapter 12, verse 44. And although this is another study which I intend to put together, did you know that the Greek parousia, which people term the second coming, has a prefix and a suffix? The suffix ousia, being Strong's number 3776, is actually defined as one's property or possession. And the prefix para means to come along besides that possession. And those that will arrive again into the inhabited earth to come beside that possession will first include all of God's holy messengers who Elijah and Moses will be among. Now, in the third occurrence of the Greek word exodos, we will examine how Peter, James, and John were taken to the Mount of Transfiguration, and there they witnessed Elijah, Moses, and Jesus, who all appeared to them in their glorified bodies. Now, I have much to say about this subject, but for now, let me simply say that this event was a type and a shadow of the parousia, the second coming, when judging will first be inaugurated when resurrections begin and the dead are awakened. Now, Peter, James, and John were heavy with sleep, it states, and this was symbolic of death for those who are in the sleep of death. And this glorious event on the mountain was a type and a shadow of when the first fruit saints, which I mention all through my videos, will come beside that possession, will come knocking, when those who will hear the voice of the Son of Mankind will open and either go into life, and understand that Exodus is not the consummation of Aeonian life. It is the entrance that will lead towards it, towards the new heaven and earth, okay? Towards the last trump. And then, of course, there's the other side of those who will go out into judging to suffer consequence for their actions in their injustice. And also notice that the knocking and opening, that's talked about in Luke chapter 12. Because this is far from the description of the Greek harpazo, which everybody calls rapture. But as Peter speaks in his second epistle, it is a rescuing and it is a keeping. The rescue is for the godly, the keeping is for the judging. This is not a snatching away or a catching away, as seen with Philip in Acts 8:39, which, by the way, was a harpazo. Like I said, that is to occur at the consummation when the sheep and the goats are severed. Many people who teach about the parousia, or call it the second coming of Christ, teach it as if there is only one single event termed the second coming, which is the Greek, again, parousia. But this is not what the Bible reveals to us in accord with the last days and the judging. See, there is a parousia that involves the rescue of the devout, like I said, out of trial, which is the Exodus, and the keeping for the chastening judging. This is different from the epiphania of his parousia at the consummation. You see, at the beginning, when there is a knocking and those are to be hearing, there will be no brawling and no clamoring, and nor will certain ones hear the voice reporting this judging, etc. Now, there is also the advent, like I mentioned, which the Greek is epiphania, of his parousia, where we get our English word epiphany. And this epiphany will be for all to see, which involves the destroying of Satan at the consummation, or the end of judgment, when Christ arrives with much power and glory, with a shout of voices, trumpeting, when it says all the tribes of the earth will see. Okay? And they'll all hear when the Son of Mankind arrives with his sign as far as the east is from the west, which is read in Matthew chapter 24, verses 29 through 31. And it even states in Matthew 24:29, this is after the affliction of those days, because the affliction is the judging. See, the so-called rapture, or the harpazo, as read in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 17, is in the context of this time at the end, not that which will occur at the conclusion of the present administration of grace. And I have already stated that probably 2 times or 3 times, but it bears repeating. Now, God willing, I will make more videos going into much more detail with the scriptures as to how all of this is laid out for our understanding, with no contradictions, with no confusion. That is, unless you are trying to reconcile all of this with the spurious book of Revelation, as it talks about great white thrones and cube cities descending out of heaven and millenniums, really of which many of these things are only found in this book. Please forget about the book of Revelation and begin to listen to what Jesus taught through his apostles, and not what some angel brought to this John the divine. So let's look at the third occurrence of Exodus as found in Luke chapter 9, verse 31. And first consider the King James Version. It says, "Who appeared in glory and spake of his decease, which he should accomplish at Jerusalem." And the his here is supposedly reflecting to Jesus, but it's not. So here the King James again uses the word decease to translate the Greek exodos, as if the discussion that Jesus was having with Moses in his glorified form was of his death. But the discussion was the Exodus or their Exodus, reflecting to the three men that had just been awakened out of their heavy sleep. Because remember, the definition of Exodus, as clearly seen in Hebrews 11:22, points to a mass emigration, not the death of any one person. You see, if the subject here was Jesus' death, the Greek teletao would have been perfectly fine, but that's not the subject. As for the concordant version, I've got to give kudos for them in their transliteration of Exodus into Exodus, but we still have some problems, which we'll pick back up on in part 2.